Good morning. So we covered the first section of ecology. We're going into this second little section. Again, trying to get through this quickly, but I really find this stuff interesting and I love it. So if I get excited or ramble, just know that I'm covering quickly through stuff that we'd spend more time on normally. So the second, or actually it's part 3 of chapter 3, but that's energy flow and ecosystem. So we kind of talked about how organisms get their energy, and now we're going to talk more specifically how it flows through the ecosystem. So we're going to always start with a primary producer. So remember, the word producer means to make. So they're the organism that's going to produce their own food, right? So primary producers create their own food. From there, a consumer can eat the producers, right? Those consumers are going to be herbivores, right? They're eating producers, generally speaking. So primary consumer, they're the first consumers. Secondary consumers are going to be our carnivores because they're eating primary consumers. So energy is moving from the sun into the producer's making food, then that food is in the producer itself, and then the consumer is going to consume that producer, and then guess what? Another consumer will consume that. And then from a secondary, you could have tertiary, which would be like third level consumers. Usually that's about as high as it goes in a lot of ecosystems, and that would be considered an apex predator. So to kind of give you an image of a primary producer, right, we got grass. Then a primary consumer like a rabbit would be an herbivore that's going to consume the producer. And then the secondary consumer, something like a snake, that is going to consume the rabbits. And then finally, maybe something like a hawk that could eat the snake, right? And so that's kind of the movement of energy. It starts in the sun, comes into the producer, and then it's going to move through. Now, this is called a food chain, right? So it's a chain, a link. They're linked together. There's a direct link from one organism to another. And their feeding relationships may be more complicated, since some secondary consumers may also be primary consumers. Examples would be omnivores, right, where they're going to eat both primary consumers and they're also going to eat some primary producers. Okay, so don't think of it as always this perfect chain, but that's an example of that. Okay, now let's look at how we can draw and analyze these in different pyramids. So there's different ways that environmental science people would want to look at the way that energy is moving. And so you have what's called a energy pyramid, and it's used up. The energy is used up as it moves through organisms, right? So the producers are always going to have the majority of the energy in them, and then the first level consumers are only going to get about 10% of the energy from the producer that they consume, which is why a consumer is going to need a lot more of the producers so that they can get all the energy they need, right? And so as you move up the food chain, what you actually start to see is that there's usually less and less organisms on each level of that food chain, and in what we would call here the trophic level. So you remember troph is to eat, and so the levels at which organisms are eating, so these trophic levels can then be seen and analyzed on the pyramid, right? And so each level you find fewer organisms. We can also look at this in a pyramid of numbers to kind of analyze the number of organisms. So usually you're going to have at the bottom of the food chain the producers you're going to have the most of in your environment, right? Because if not enough energy is accessible to your first level or primary consumers, right? And then same thing for your secondary consumers. You're going to have the least amount of secondary consumers in your environment, generally speaking, because they need to have enough of the secondary consumers to fulfill their needs. So if there's too many lions in an environment, right, they're not going to have access to enough secondary consumers to get the nutrients they need. And so what you actually would see then is that the lions would die off. Okay, so that's kind of how it works in the environment. And then finally, we can look at it in terms of biomass. And so generally speaking, this is just like how you would see in the pyramid of numbers, the greatest amount of organisms at the bottom. in the pyramid of numbers, in the biomass pyramid, the majority of mass in the environment, so biomass, living mass, the living amount. So if you put all the organisms together and took their mass, put them on a scale, right, you should generally see that the plants have the greatest, or the producers have the most, and then it's less on each level. This isn't totally true in the ocean, because in the ocean you don't really have as many producers, so you may see actually a higher amount of consumers, and there's other ecosystems where it might vary, but generally speaking, that's how it works when it comes to pyramids. So those are the three different pyramids: energy pyramids, pyramid of numbers, and biomass pyramids that environmental scientists would look at the environment to analyze how healthy your ecosystem is, and just kind of to analyze, is there enough of what we need at the bottom of the food chain to provide for what's at the top of the food chain, and vice versa. And you can kind of see where there's maybe issues. So let's look at, for example, in a lot of the US, we've eliminated the top predators, or the third level consumers or second level consumers, and because of that, there's actually a lot more first level consumers like deer and rabbit and squirrels. And in some places that's caused a lot of issues with the environment because they're overeating, overtaxing the producers. Now let's look at the food pyramid versus a food web. So like I said in the first section where I was showing you those trophic levels and the going from the food chain, going across the food chain, right? Feeding relationships are not cut and dry, right? Some are going to feed at various levels of the trophic levels, right? So I mentioned trophic levels before, but here's kind of another image. You got your different trophic levels. Starts with the producers at the bottom, primary consumers, secondary consumers, and then tertiary consumers, or apex predators. And then you see over there detritivores, remember, like worms and other organisms that eat decaying matter. So they're going to kind of fit into kind of all levels in a sense, because they're helping break down organisms. Same with decomposers. Decomposers don't really fit into one specific trophic level. So just keep that in mind too. Okay, but let's look at what a food web looks like. So if I take a food web, I'm analyzing all the organisms and their relationships with each other in terms of feeding, right? So you can see there's a fox and an owl that are kind of at the top, and the foxes eat the birds, they eat the rabbits. Technically, there should even be an arrow from the mice, maybe even the grasshoppers. And foxes are omnivores, so they may even eat sometimes some berries, etc. So there's complexity to their diet, which is why you may see more foxes than seems reasonable in terms of general trophic level food chain type thing, right? So it's important for us to also analyze the food web, because some organisms play roles in different places, right? And they're not just a primary consumer or just a secondary consumer. They may be both, or they may play kind of a medium role, okay? So we just looked at energy. Now we're going to look at matter, because matter and energy are different, right? So energy is gathered from the sun, converted into food. Matter is the chemicals we are all made up of, okay? And matter cannot be created or destroyed. So energy essentially gets used up. Matter does not, and so matter cycles. So we're going to talk about those cycles, but you know, you can look at soil, right? Soil is made up of lots of nutrients, lots of different chemicals. Even the plant here is made up of lots of different nutrients and chemicals, and the person here is made up of different nutrients and chemicals. When any of those living things die, their nutrients are going to get brought back into the environment. When the nutrients are used up in the soil by these organisms, to get them back, that's why there's decomposition, right? So essentially, you know, you go through the use of the nutrients and energy, and there's growth, but then there's decay and decomposition. The nutrients get brought back into the environment, okay? We call these the biogeochemical cycles, okay? Bio means living, right? Geo means earth. Chemical means chemicals, right? So essentially it's the cycle of chemicals moving through the earth and through the living things in the environment, right? So if you look in the top left, that's kind of an image showing a lot of different nutrients moving through the environment. Specifically, some of the ones that we would look at are phosphorus and sulfur in that top left. But there's also other things being kind of analyzed there. In the top right, we're looking at the water cycle. And so water is obviously made up of hydrogen and oxygen, and so both those are going to cycle through. The bottom left is going to be the nitrogen cycle, and the bottom right is the carbon cycle. And so all those things, if you put all of those elements next to each other and were to write them out, it'd be CHNOPS, right? I don't know if you remember CHNOPS. We talked about macromolecules or biomolecules in your body, but you got carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. These are the primary elements that our bodies need to function because they make up our biomolecules, okay? And so if you remember, you got proteins, lipids, carbs, and nucleic acids. And both carbs and lipids are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And then you add in nitrogen for your proteins, and then phosphorus and occasionally sulfur are ones that are also in your nucleic acids, okay? So that's how you kind of see them all in the organism itself. So although water and sunlight may be present in an ecosystem, right? They may be present in a location. Without those other nutrients, ecosystems will fail. The organisms cannot survive. So some organisms have adapted to get these nutrients. And so some examples would be legumes, which are peanuts, beans, peas, etc. And they're going to use bacteria to fix nitrogen into the soil from the air. So nitrogen's a really hard chemical to get because it doesn't cycle through very easily. A lot of it's found in the air, but to get it into the soil, it needs to be fixated. So nitrogen fixation is the process by which root nodules that have bacteria, the bacteria on the root nodules of legumes will fix it into the ground and save it, store it up for other things. This is why farmers are going to cycle through their crops so that they put legumes in to help with that. Not all farmers do this, but good farmers are going to be wise and put legumes at some point so that they fixate the nitrogen back in because other organisms that they planted, like other crops, have sucked it out. Another example would be carnivorous plants where they're using they obviously have enough water and sunlight, but what they don't have is enough nitrogen also. And so they'll get this nitrogen by consuming flies, etc., or other organisms that have the nitrogen in it. They have to get it because the nutrients in the soil aren't there, and so they've adapted to survive in environments where that's the case. So what we can say is that nitrogen is considered a limiting nutrient, right? Essentially, anything that's a nutrient that if it's not found in the environment, it limits the growth of organisms. It's a limiting nutrient. So nitrogen's a big one, potassium, phosphorus, and these generally are found in fertilizers. But certain organisms have adapted, like I said, to help the environment and help themselves to survive in it by capturing these limiting nutrients, right? A big problem with limiting nutrients, and also a way that we can kind of see where there's been an excess of what we would call fertilizers that are pollutants, right, would be in places where there's big algal blooms, which is basically when the water starts to grow lots and lots of algae on top of it and gets really green. And that's because the fertilizers have the nutrients that help plants to grow very quickly. And so essentially, if somewhere has that quick growth, it's because it has it has an increase in nutrients that normally it wouldn't have. And so that's where we can kind of see where pollution has occurred. So it's important for them to have those nutrients, but sometimes we add them on our own, and it's not good for the environment. So here are your review questions I want you to answer. So what do primary consumers eat? What term for the first ecology notes video could be given to them to describe their feeding habits? Do omnivores fit into one trophic level? Explain why or why not. Explain the major differences between how energy moves through the environment and how matter moves through the environment. Why do you think there's a food chain and a food web? Is one better than the other for understanding how the environment and a specific ecosystem works? And finally, nitrogen is an example of what nutrient? If there's not enough nitrogen or other what nutrients in the environment, what will happen to organisms who cannot get them?